There's a popular phrase that many of us are familiar with that goes a little something like this. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. And many of us have probably studied history in school under the light of this concept and learned that depending on who writes the history books, we might get a different version of history. And if we have been blessed to know people who have come from other countries and immigrated here, legally of course, we likely have also learned that the history that we know may have been written in a different fashion as to the history that has been written about our country within another nation. But I'm not here to talk about what's the comparison between the historical references of nations compared to nations. I'm here to talk about astrology. So in the year of 2026, we have an interesting anniversary coming upon us in the nation of the United States, which is that it's our 250th anniversary of becoming a nation. What coincidentally is interesting about this is that there are some planetary placements that we can look back to and get a different kind of feel or vibe about that time, aside from maybe that paragraph that's written in the historical books that we've been conditioned to know as our nation's history. So I just want to draw some, pinpoints historically for you to be able to kind of look back and maybe do your own research or even draw your own conclusions. But with everything that's going on currently in our country of the United States and even globally, I think it's important to look back at these things so that we can be a little better prepared and learn to refine our toolkit as far as how we respond to the world. We are, after all, in 2026, and we are bombarded with information every single day, and with things trying to vie for our attention and our energy at every single moment. So we have to be more and more careful as to where we place our attention and what kind of influences we surround ourselves and what we choose to engage with in the world. And that's part of our own evolution as a human being, and also in how we want to show up and what we want to contribute our energy with or to in the world. So I just want to kind of point out a couple of things. So 250 years ago, there were some interesting astrological occurrences that were happening. And the biggest thing was that Pluto was in the sign of Aquarius. Now, that might not be a big deal to many, but Pluto is interestingly in the sign of Aquarius now, which is just a timely occurrence, being that Pluto takes 248 years to move around our sun, that's its orbit, in our solar system. So we can look at things like that from the outer planets because they have such a longer orbit. We can look at things historically and where they were placed in the sky and what things have happened historically to get some insight as to what the vibe was and what was happening historically, so we can better prepare for our current times that we are currently entering into. So it's important mostly for us to look at outer planets because they have such a long orbit, whereas the inner planets, they move so quickly. They're considered personal planets. They affect us in our personal lives, and yet, planets like Pluto that have an orbit of 248 years, we're not going to experience it in the same place it was when we were born. So we won't be able to have that same insight. As a, comparison, some of the kind of in-between planets, like the planet of Saturn, which has a 28.5-year cycle, those we can see the influence of them in our personal lives as we look back at them historically, for instance, if you've lived beyond the time of 30 years. So planets can give us this insight into the historical past. So I just want to look at what was going on so that you can maybe draw some insight as to what we are currently engaging with, so you can have a better understanding and ultimately choose where you want to put your energy. So let's keep in mind that the quote, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, was first written or, born, so to speak, by the person named George Santayana. He was a Spanish-American author and philosopher who lived in the time period of 1863 to 1952. Now, I want want to look at what's going on with a couple of planets here, and that's what I just want to kind of draw our attention toward for our ability to connect some dots to the current times. The first one, which I had pointed out, is the planet of Pluto. Pluto, as I said, was in the sign of Aquarius 250 years ago, roughly. It was also during the time of the American Revolutionary War, which was during the time period of 1775 and 1783. Interestingly enough, other planetary positions that were in placement during that time, which are key to note, is the planet of Uranus. Now, Uranus was in the sign of Gemini during that time period. It went into the sign of Gemini in April of 1775. And guess what? Uranus is about to go into Gemini. Uranus will be going into Gemini this year on April 27th, and it will be in the sign of Gemini until August of 2032. Pluto will be in the sign of Aquarius until roughly January of 2044. Now, this is just a reminder, and maybe something to consider, is that every 84 years, Uranus completes its orbit, and every 84 years, it is in the sign of Gemini, roughly for about 7 years. Now, historically, whenever Uranus has been in the sign of Gemini, the United States has seen war or some kind of challenge to its nation. Now, we can look at this when we look back just 84 years ago, during the period of 1939 and 1945, when we were experiencing World War II. Now, when we jump back to beyond that, 84 years prior to that, we were looking at the 1860s, which was when the U.S. was in turmoil and change, and that decade roughly was the Civil War. So every time Uranus is in this placement of Gemini, we see turmoil in our country. And being that we also have Pluto in the sign of Aquarius, there's also a lot of time of transformation and change and revolution, because that is ultimately what Pluto is responsible for. And in Aquarius, it's like the big picture and the outcome of society. So we have these two influences that are occurring right now, which I think are important for us to consider. We also need to look back and see, when was Pluto discovered? Pluto was discovered in the 1930s. That doesn't mean it didn't have influence prior to the 1930s. We just didn't know about it until the 1930s. And in looking at that, it's also interesting to study astrology and consider when certain planets were discovered, because that's when we tend to have some kind of evolution or development in our society by way of either, some kind of innovation of sorts. And when we had the discovery of Pluto, it was considered the time of invention and discovery, and that was also the time when we discovered nuclear weapons and things that, ultimately could burn the bridge without any return. So these planets that we are becoming aware of, or having a better understanding of their influence of our actual history, are important to understand and look at, not only in our personal lives, but also historically, so that we can have a better understanding of how we want to contribute to the world. Now, with that said, I did mention where we put our energy is really crucially important. Now, in the 1990s, there was an interesting experiment done in Washington, D.C., where roughly 4,000 practitioners of meditation joined together, and by their group meditations out in public places, were able to lower the crime rate in that area by a notable percentage over a matter of months. And so I say this to remind you that your energy is important. What you contribute to by your conversations, by your inner dialogue, and who you engage with is crucial, not only to you, but to the world that we live in and the community that we surround ourselves with. So, study history or be doomed to repeat it. Sending you love and blessings on your journey. And remember, you don't have to engage with trolls.